from what I read, Kierkegaard was not the only one using pseudonyms. It seemed like the thing to do. A lot of the writers in town used fake names to sign their works in public, and so there was kind of this community effort to try to figure out who's the one that really wrote this, and Kierkegaard himself plays this game quite well. It seems really an odd Copenhagen Danish thing to do. Right? But so he sells lots of books, but at the same time he's out of money, and he collapses on the street and never really recovers. One little point, when he was a young kid, he fell out of a tree and hurt his back and always had a limp. Always had some pain. But it's also, if you remember, I've mentioned her before, I think, and Touched with Fire. She herself is an example of someone with bipolarity, manic depressive illness, and in this book she goes and studies people like William James, who we haven't done yet, but also Kierkegaard and others, and argues that these significant individuals in the past, in their work, seem to indicate to her, being manic depressive, that they were manic depressive. When you're looking at his history, you can see that he's just writing a fantastic amount. He goes to Berlin for 4 months, he comes back with Either Or in his suitcase. A whole book of 800 pages in volume 1, plus a volume 2. I don't know how many pages, they never said. But you get the idea. This is a manic period. But he comes out of that and he's depressed. But he did depress me, by the way. I read some of his work. Remember, I'm warning you guys, be careful. But in reading him, I got so angry at him. I read The Diary of the Seducer. It was just absolutely infuriating. This guy decides that he's going to seduce a young woman. And he figures out all these steps, very scientific about how he's going to just gradually get her interested in him, more and more interested, until eventually she's the one in love with him, and then he's going to invite her to elope with him. She actually comes out of the house at 3 a.m. with her suitcase, gets in the wagon, the cab, and is driven to the park where she's supposed to wait for him to join her, and he never joins her. He abandons her at that point in the story. And you're like, what? Wait a minute. That's absolutely horrific to do. That is such an abusive thing to do to a person. And apart from it being a short story part of Either Or, it's also biographical. He was engaged to Regine Olsen for quite a while, and gradually did this scientific approach to encouraging Regine to fall in love with him. She does. She's 18, he's in his 20s, even later maybe, almost 30. She's expecting to marry him. Her father expects him to marry. At one point where he's changing his mind and saying it's off, the father leaves, the two of them leave dinner, and the father walks with him for a while trying to convince him to not break it off. I mean, this was, not really just like in the story where he just decides not to come and meet her at the park. 3 a.m. in the morning. But instead he literally, and this is why it occurred to me just this morning that, gosh, he's got a lot of characteristics of an incel. In so many places, he describes the matronly woman who has experienced the full sexual experience a couple times. This is a guy that doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, actually. It's all in his imagination that he's thinking.
Was The Seducer a real story? Or just like...
The Seducer's a story. I interpret it as very close. It's a part of his work that he writes in Berlin, but it is so similar to his actual biographical experience with Regine that, you know, it looks like it's like, and by the way, Regine interpreted it that way as well. Other people did, you know, so yeah, you could dive into all this stuff and try to figure out, you know, how biographical is this. But Kay Redfield argues he's manic depressive. In a way, his decision to not get married to Regine, and he writes this, is to protect her from him. He would be hellacious to try to live with because of these manic depressive leaps that he takes. Of course, she's just being a psychiatrist trying to figure out, you know, you're not supposed to do that with someone you're not actually treating as a patient. But he dies on the street. I suspect he dies because he was never able to actually persuade himself that his life was meaningful. Even though he took the leap of faith and came to conclude that the Lutheran faith was the correct faith to believe. I don't think he really ever believed it. He had too many criticisms of the church. By the way, he had enough criticisms of the church that the church refused to let him be buried in sacred ground. So he didn't think he was a real believer. So, existentialism, in a sense, I mean, this is, you know, he's the one that existentialists hail as the existentialist that started existentialism. Remember my critique, though, is he did spend time 4 months in Berlin listening to Friedrich Schelling lecture. And he writes to, you know, he's got letters, he writes to friends, and he says, you know, man, can this guy lecture? He's just so fantastic. Although he had some quirks. He was from southern Germany, so he had an accent, which, you know, they thought kind of weird. Plus, Kierkegaard, his biggest complaint about Berlin was that there weren't bathrooms outside where you could go. You had to remember exactly where you could get to go to the bathroom. And so he writes, a lot of people, they say, well, oh, I have something I have to go do. It's just their expression for I've got to go to the bathroom. By the way, I won't be coming back because I have to go so far to go pee that I'm not going to be back to finish our nice walk here in the Tier Garden, the animal garden. And that was there even when I lived there. It was kind of neat. It was a zoo then. It was just a park at the time that he was there. But he did listen to Schelling, and Schelling's philosophy, by Schelling's own naming, was existence philosophy, which sounds an awful lot like existential philosophy to me. However, for Kierkegaard and for those who consider themselves existentialists afterwards, the real focus is this individual has to make their own lives significant for themselves, because no one's going to help you do that. It's your choice. And so another example of this, much later, is Jean-Paul Sartre. Oh. By the way, we should always point out Simone de Beauvoir was his mate. They didn't get married. I don't think they ever got married. They were committed to one another, except that he was also committed to about 50 other women. She was fine with that, apparently. He was very popular. You know, Heidegger had the same issue. Heidegger was married, and Hannah Arendt, his graduate student, was also his lover. And I remember reading the one time the two, Heidegger and his wife, met Hannah at a hotel, at a lobby, and obviously Mrs. Heidegger is completely aware of this relationship and has no concern about it. Her only concern was Hannah Arendt smoked too much. So she did have a critique of Hannah Arendt. But so Jean-Paul Sartre, as a existentialist who admits that he is an existentialist, which is kind of paradoxical, because many existentialists refuse to call themselves an existentialist, because existentialism is considered a school of thought, and if you're a total individual deciding for yourself, it's wrong for you to think of yourself as a member of a school of thought. Sorry, is that okay? See how that works? But Jean-Paul Sartre says existentialism is a humanism. That's the title of one of his books. His big one is Being and Nothingness, L'Être et le Néant. And what's cool about that whole thing is that you have, of course, Kant writing his works, and then you have Hegel writing, maybe his Logic was kind of the big one when it talks about in the beginning is being and nothingness. Being and nothingness. And the two of them interact with one another in a dialectical interplay of forces, and you end up with the universe. And then you get other people that write in response to this, like Heidegger, for example, writes Being and Time. That's Heidegger's big book, Sein und Zeit, right? Being and Time. L'Être et le Néant is a response to Heidegger. He's arguing with Heidegger about being and nothingness. And being and nothingness for Sartre, I think I might have already mentioned, nothingness is the ability to negate that humans have. And as a result, it seems like it breaks the causal chain of events, because we can stop it and say no. And so he describes the human, as coiled in the heart of being like a worm. And one of his novels, La Nausée means nauseousness, nausea, is about a garçon who comes to realize that everything is totally dependent on him for its meaning. And as a result, he comes to realize that everything is his fault. And when he realizes it, he's looking at a tree root and he throws up. It's a French novel. Throws up on a tree root. That's the climax of the book. The realization that everything is his fault. And for Sartre, if there's something going on in the world, the war in Sudan, you feel like, gee, I have nothing to do with that. It's your fault. Everything is your fault. If you feel like that ought not to be happening, you are responsible for going and doing something about it. You think, geez, you can't go and try to fix every damn thing that there is going on. For me, one of the best things is I can hide out in Alaska where I'm so far away from everything. We feel relatively safe, at least in this area of Alaska. You know, if you're living along the coast, different kinds of storms and everything that just wash you away, right? But at least we're safe here for the moment, it seems. But we do have the ring of fire. The volcanoes could blow. I have nightmares of snow falling so heavily and so thick that I actually have to wake up and get out up on my roof and try to keep some kind of air hole for all the oxygen to get into the house. You might think that's hilarious, but when I first moved up here, Valdez had 300 inches of snow. If you've ever driven to Valdez, you know along the route there through Thompson Pass, they have those great big things so the trucks can figure out where the road is. 300 inches. There were stories of people up on the roofs of their houses shoveling the snow up into the pile. And one person fell off the roof and disappeared. They found that person in the spring, in the snow, where they had died. We can have snow like that. It's possible. Chicago is supposed to get 90 inches this week, according to one news source. 90 inches of snow. Maybe it was 9 inches. Oh well.
I think it was 9.
Maybe it was 9.
At 9 inches.
Late snow effect.
You crawling through your attic just to get here. Not into your car, just a snowshoe. I guess.
Well, we can check because it's supposed to be happening now, so we'll find out. No, he has an actual reason for arguing this way. He was part of the French underground during the Nazi occupation and was actually captured and continued to write in prison. And in fact, the Nazi censors allowed his plays to be performed even though they made fun of the Nazis themselves. Which my only interpretation of how that was possible was that the Nazis knew that the plays were against the Nazi regime, and the Nazi censors were so intellectual, they were actually not really Nazis. So they let it go. But at the end of World War II, we were the ones who won, and our allies, right? The Allies won. And so the Axis powers lose, and they are put on trial. And we find them guilty of breaking our laws. And so we put a lot of them to death for that. Remember when we were talking about Plato and the question of justice, and one of the theories of justice was the interest of the stronger, IS, remember? IS, the interest of the stronger. And I pointed out that it's not that the stronger gets their way, is that the stronger imposes their narrative of what is true on those who lose. If Trump, for example, ends up succeeding, he's convincing a lot of people to believe the narrative that is not really, I'm sure it's not really coming from Trump, even though he calls himself a stable genius. That's hilarious because a stable is, where you keep horses and cows and things. And you wouldn't have to be much of a genius to be smarter than the horses and the cows. But
Nice
he's following Steve Bannon and Russell Vogt, however you say, Russell Vogt, and Peter Thiel, and there's a whole slew of folks behind Project 2025 and all of those kinds of things, many of which are clearly not conservative at all, actually. But if he succeeds and he convinces people, he's imposing his narrative. The end of World War II